So Gary, as an experienced dealer, you and I must be, like me, going crazy. What a plethora of riches to have 7 impressions in any one place.
I know I only have like 6. Yeah.
It's like, very frustrating. But one who has worked for decades with auction houses, can you tell us a bit about the market history for the Great Wave? Impressions that have sold publicly, both in the 20th and 21st century, and give us some insight on how you might explain those prices in that context.
Okay, thank you, Joan. What I'm going to try to do is just give you a quick overview of the Great Wave sales at public auction, mostly in the United States. I mentioned one in London, over the last 50 years, 51 years now, 52 years actually. So the first one, I'm going to sort of go quickly because it's getting late. The first one was sold at Park Burnett Galleries. It was the McFetridge sale, which had the Frank Lloyd Wright collection, some of the Frank Lloyd Wright prints in it. And that sold for $1,650. That was a lot of money. That was a lot of money in 1969. Prices at that point are starting to now get up there where people said, well, I think we could buy Japanese prints again and look to the future instead of the past. And so that was a lot of money, $1,650 in 1969. Moving on to 1974 at the Vevey sale, Vevey 1 sold for, now from 69 to 74, that's 5 years. The Vevey 1 sold for 5,000 pounds, about $7,000. Which was a lot of money. And then we see in 1976 at Park Burnett in New York, we saw one from the Lewis Black collection, and that sold for $7,000. Just a quick side note, in 2018, a New York dealer sold that exact print for almost $600,000, okay? That was in 2018. 1979 at Sotheby Park Burnett, the Gaines sale, there was a very nice example, and that one went for $21,000, which was already a step up for 3 years before. Then in 1984, Christie's had a very nice example, and it sold for $45,000. Then in 86, there was one that was faded. It wasn't that great. It went for $26,000. Then in 1989, which is a very strong part in the Japanese print market in 1989, one went for $75,000, which was a lot of money, $75,000. Again, this isn't every print. This is an overview of, just to give you an idea, but it's a lot of them. In 1992, Christie sold one for $70,000, and then in 2000, one went for almost $100,000, $99,500. In 2003, there was one that was a faded trim, not so good at all, and that one for $26,290 at Christie's. And then in 2009, one went for almost $70,000, $68,500. So that was 2009. The next print I'm going to talk about came up in 2017. So there weren't that many really nice ones and things in that period from 2009 to 2017 in general. This is at public auction. But in 2017, Christie sold one for almost $1 million, $943,500. It was a huge jump of things, even privately. Privately, there were Great Waves being sold for about $400,000 at that period. This one going for almost $1 million. And it was a nice one. It was some fading, but it was a really nice impression. And it had no centerfold. So this was an interesting benchmark, because when something goes for that kind of money, things start coming out of the woodwork. So a landmark price for that, people started selling them. And between 2017 and 2020, one dealer sold 5 Great Waves for in that mid $400,000 to $600,000 range, far from that $1 million range. But because there were more, those more that were appearing on the market, again, supply and demand, we saw one that came up at Bonhams in 2019 that went for $475,000. And that was half, but it wasn't as good as the one that went for $1 million, but it's still, you see the price, coming down, supply and demand, the supplies are out there. And in 2019, Bonhams had just had one 6 months before, and then they had one they sold for $237,000. So it's going down because, well, they're out there, not as rare. It's interesting because that print was bought in 2005 by that collector, and they paid $67,000 in 2005, and they got $237,000 for it. The impression wasn't that great. It was faded. It had a centerfold on that print. And the interesting thing was, now we come to the print that we're looking at, which was the one that was sold at Christie's literally a few months later. And it was a similar kind of impression as the one at Bonhams, but it didn't have a centerfold. This one, Bonhams had a centerfold, and this impression is a little bit better. Color was sort of similar, but this one went for over $1.1 million, which was the record for a Japanese print. So in finishing up, it's hard to predict. You would think because those things had come up, you saw the prices drop, that maybe another one coming up, maybe it would have gone for like, 250, 300,000, 350 maybe. But two people wanted it and they had the means, and that was the bottom line. Two people wanted it and the person who paid the most got it. So in closing, if you have a great wave, you have something that's worth a lot of money. So thank you, Joan.
Yes, keep it out of the sunlight.
Yeah, exactly.
My last question to a panelist is to Christine. And I would ask, in your research through the years, can you give us some examples, fun examples or otherwise, of how this iconic imagery has been repurposed by other cultures, and how the image is going to represent ideas very different from what Hokusai's original intent was?
Sure, it's hard to choose because there's so many of them. But let me give you 4 examples that give you some sense of the range of reinventions. This is one from the 19th century. And I chose it because it speaks very much to the importance of the reception of Japanese prints in Europe at the time. In Europe, the Great Wave motif was redeployed to express the artistic modernity that Japanese prints helped to provoke. And here we see the Great Wave quite literally overturning and engulfing traditional artistic norms that are symbolized by the easel, which you see falling overboard on the left. But this print also says more than its subject matter. This is a lithograph, and it's by Josso, and it's part of a series of lithographs called L'Estampe Originale, which was intended to make art more democratic by making it more accessible to the middle class through printmaking. So I think this is a very significant use of the wave in 19th century Europe. If we can move to the next one. The Great Wave has been used for political and social commentary, often in a very funny way, in a humorous way. And this is a t-shirt from the 1990s, which I have thanks to a colleague in California. And I love this t-shirt because, or excuse me, it's a sweatshirt, because it reminds the viewer that behind every great artist, there is a woman who carries out daily tasks like doing the laundry. One that can be rather threatening as we see this giant wave emerging from a top-loading washing machine. The Great Wave is an advertiser's dream. Yeah, you can go on to the next one. Thank you, Bonnie. An advertiser's dream. It's dramatic, it's oversized, it's in your face, and it can be put to so many different purposes. But I think one of the most unlikely I've ever seen is as a label for an Alsatian wine that was available at Trader Joe's about 15 years ago. And what has been done here, if you can look at the view on the right, is the great wave has been stretched upward and the boat and figure is not cutting through it, but is riding. So this sort of tipsy tall wave is used as a kind of play on tipsiness, but also to accentuate the verticality of the bottle. But obviously this is a kind, it was not an expensive wine. It's the kind of label that would grab your attention when it's on the shelf. Not only did whoever designed it use the wave, but they've also punned with another stereotype of Japan in labeling the wine now and zen. Obviously a play on now and then. The last use that I want to bring up is not a humorous one by any means. The Great Wave, and increasingly now, has been used for environmental causes. But this is a fairly early example from Gourmet magazine, I think in the 1990s. But what, it's a plea for clean water. But what I think is particularly striking about this particular advertisement is that it was sponsored by both Japanese and American organizations. And that serves as a reminder that environmentalism is a collaborative, transnational effort. And it also shows, I think, the way the Great Wave has become part of a shared global culture. So with that, I close. Thank you, Joan.
Thank you, Christine. Wow, very powerful image. Would be nice if they brought that back. I think we need more graphic images like that to inspire us. So in closing, I would like to ask our panel one quick question and just get a brief response from them as to, in a sentence or two at the most, could you give us your insights at what you think the biggest myths and misconceptions are regarding this iconic image? And I'd like to start with Sarah, since she's the one who set the stage for us initially.
Okay. I'm unmuted. Okay. Two of the biggest misconceptions that I get over and over and have to explain to people are first, a great deal of the general public is confused about the difference between a painting and a print. This is something that Christine touched on, but I often have to explain to people about the concept of multiple originals. There is no original of the Great Wave, insofar as there ever was one that presumably would have been Hokusai's drawing that was destroyed when they cut the blocks, and the point was to make multiples. So that's one misconception or misunderstanding. Another comment that people frequently made when they came to the Hokusai show and saw the whole series, including the Wave, was that it was much smaller than they expected. So, about 10 by 15 inches, about 2 sheets of typing paper side by side is how big it is. And people were surprised. Partly that's because it looms large. But I tried to explain that I think one reason it became so popular or became so well known is that it was small and therefore affordable. So many of them were made. Lots of people could afford to buy it, to have it, to pass it around. This is before the internet. You have to actually see the physical object, and if it's small and cheap, that helps.
Terrific. Great. I've had that myself as a dealer, where people are surprised how small ukiyo-e really is. They're so powerful and so graphic. Michiko, can you give us your thoughts on that question?
For me, it's really the pink sky, I think, because
Yeah.
although, like I said, I don't know how much brighter it would have been, I think it would have been very noticeable and a little bit more prominent. So I think people would have viewed it a little bit more differently. Yeah.
Terrific. And Matthew, I don't see your picture up here.
I'm here.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, I would say that in response to your question, that the one of the bigger misconceptions that I consider about the Great Wave could be its originality. I'd like to temper that that concept or that perception of the image, because we know that even within Hokusai's own career, he produced many images of waves, starting with the series that Sarah showed us. I think there's one in that group, even printed in blue, as well as the images from the 100 Views of Mount Fuji, in which he has that dramatic image of waves turning into plovers that Christine showed us. And beyond that, of course, are the just generations and generations and centuries of images of the sea and images of waves that precede it. I always start my survey classes when I teach them with, you'll usually have a couple of ceramics, and then I'll show a couple of paintings, and I might put in an image of the Great Wave, because that's the one thing that students probably would come to such a class expecting to see. And I usually manage to get to Hokusai. Sometimes I get a little bit further, but I find it really interesting to see how they themselves, these younger budding students of Asian art, start to unpack the image and see different things in it. And one of the things that they often comment on is that they've been sort of prepped to see this, is the low horizon, and to see how different that is. The low horizon, literally, as we would call landscape format of the landscape, which in East Asian painting is new in the Edo period. Typically, landscapes are vertical. And so we ourselves, as Westerners, back in the 19th century, were also prepared for seeing the Great Wave when it was produced. All of the prompts that appeal to our own visual sensibilities of low horizons, fairly clear perspective relationships, and even color, I think are all provided for us. And that's part of what makes it so, I think, appealing to Western audiences, maybe more than the Red Fuji, which is my personal favorite.
Very classic Japanese taste. Thank you. And it must be interesting semester after semester encountering young people and seeing their responses to something that is now old hat to you, but with fresh eyes.
Yeah.
And educating those eyes to something else. Thank you, Matthew. And finally, Gary, you got the last comment to make. What would you like to add to the myths, which obviously are long and storied when it comes to connoisseurship and value? What would you like to tell us?
So probably what relates to this talk about sort of myths and things that might not be obvious are so many people say, even in the field, when they look at the Great Wave, so many times it's not what it looked like when it was just printed. As we spoke about, sometimes they've been touched in with color and made the impressions to be look better with touching in on the key blocks. So it's hard a lot of times to see a pure, what we call innocent one. And it's sort of funny, you know, when people looking at it and they go, oh, that's great. You know, especially like at the Met, wow, isn't that wonderful? Well, that's not what it looked like when it was printed. You know, somebody took it upon themselves to edit that. So that's sort of interesting. It's just a little ditty.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you, Joan.
Christine, I didn't mean to skip you, but being the one who looks at this on a global stage rather than the microscope of Japanese art, what would you think of as the most pervasive myths regarding this image?
Well, I think I would single out just one, and that is that it represented a tsunami. And I don't think that would have been Hokusai's intent. In fact, I'm quite sure it would not have been Hokusai's intent, because it would have been an inauspicious subject. And the print was issued as part of a series that was celebratory. So it would hardly have been appropriate to have it represent a tsunami. But today, that is very much how it's understood, particularly outside of Japan.
On that auspicious note, thank you to our panelists and all their hard work. I'm sorry we've run late, but I have to say you've stuck with us, and it's been great having you here to share all these insights from our marvelous speakers and really perceptive connoisseurs of Japanese art. Our next event will be the Winter Antique Show, the Winter Show, where we're doing a show on porcelain. And our next panel discussion will be, believe it or not, on the world of American ceramics with Jeff Shapiro, who studied in Bizen for many years. And then this will be followed in March by our Asia Week programming. And of course, there'll be a great deal of Asia Week programming on a multiplicity of topics and subjects across the Asian art platform. And so stay tuned for all of that. Thank you for being with us. Please stay safe. Please stay well and be with us in the future. We're on the home stretch, and hopefully the next time we meet, things will be better in this country and we will have turned the real 21st 2021 page to a better time. And thank you all for being here. Good night.
Thanks, Joan.